Welcome back, guys. I know this is a video you guys have been waiting to see for a long time. I have my M5, E60 M5, and my newly acquired 335 right behind me. In my opinion, these are two of the best of the breed. What we have is the best normally aspirated BMW of all time, the E60 M5 with the wonderful V10, and we have the 335i with the awesome N54 that is so tunable. So we're gonna walk through these cars outside, inside. I'm gonna take you for a drive and explain to you what I think about each car. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Mark with Exotic Car Play. Before we get setting off, guys, we look inside the cabin here. Now, getting out of the 335, it's fresh again. Looking at the M5 here, even though it's an E60, it's a similar generation. The E60 M5 compared to the E92 335 that I have, and we'll be driving that shortly. But looking around the cabin, there's a great sense of solidity. Everything, the doors close well, all the controls are pretty sturdy. There's a nice trim level in here with the aluminum trim. Even though it doesn't have the full covered leather, everything feels pretty sturdy and stout. It's got a beautiful leather interior. I would say the leather is a little softer and more supple in this car than it is in the 335. Overall, the car feels very solid. Of course, it has Alcantara ceiling space, dual paddles, and of course, overall with the iDrive or the mDrive system, the car does not feel like it's lacking in any way. It is very, very well equipped and feels that way. It's very well insulated, and actually you don't hear any noises from the outside. You probably have to hear a shotgun blast right next to the window to be able to even really hear anything out there. So very, very nicely equipped, lots of room, high quality finishing throughout. So we're gonna start the car. So the first thing you know, you've got the SMG transmission. So when you first put it over to the right, that puts you in drive. So D1 with 3 out of 5 on the shift speed settings is where it defaults. So it's sort of an average, moderate shift speed. As you can see that, it's very slow and lurchy. So setting off, we notice that the SMG is very lurchy, not a very nice transmission to use at the low speeds, particularly when you're driving it easy in 3 out of 5 bars. Not very nice. So what I tend to like to do is pull a paddle once, and now that puts me in manual mode. And now I can drive the car manually, and it actually is much more enjoyable that way. Now, the one thing I noticed, first of all, is driving the M5, and I haven't driven it for a while, is there's a very prominent sense that you're sitting up higher. The car seems more upright, and actually you feel like you're more on top of the world versus inside the world, where you in the 335, it's a little different feeling. So the M5 does feel a little bit more, you know, up on a chair, on a high chair, so to speak. But that's not a bad thing, because ultimately, regardless of what you talk about in terms of handling, you assume that you need a car that rides low. Well, I'll tell you right now, the M5 has a very aggressive turn in, a sharp feel. As a matter of fact, very sharp, sharper almost than the 335, which is also a sporty car. This car, even out of the box, without dynamic mode, you know, with standard settings, as you turn the car on, it still has a more of a darty feel. It feels more planted, sharper turn in that you get with the 335. This car feels very, very crisp. So first off, the handling definitely is more obviously sharper, stronger in this car. Never mind putting it in M mode. So we can do that M mode, and we'll do that right now. Let's switch that up briefly here. So we'll put that, we'll hit the M button. Whoa! All of a sudden what happens, you hit the M button and you can hear the revs. It jumps up, it shifts down, and all of a sudden you get the tachometer on the heads-up display, and the car immediately feels far sharper, far more sharp. So now it's in the 500 horsepower mode as soon as you hit the M button. The suspension dampers are much sharper, and the handling is very crisp. So now the car really does feel a lot more like a Lamborghini, other than the physical ride height, which is, you know, again, as I said, very elevated in this car. So we set off again. Again, we're in the M mode. Now it shifts very aggressively. We talked about the default shift speed being very obnoxious and slow and lurchy. Now the car shifts very hard, very strong. Fortunately, there's even one more aggressive setting. So out of 5, it's right now set at 5 out of 5 bars, but you can actually now, once you're in M mode, you're in M dynamic mode essentially, you can actually toggle one more shift speed. So you can make this thing ultra aggressive and ultra hard in its shifts. Now, I don't think that's necessary for the most part for just tooling around, but it does give you that ability to really hammer on the acceleration. So driving along in M mode, I notice the car is distinctively crisper. It's still quiet, but it definitely feels stronger, more stout on its feet, and the throttle input is definitely much more punchy. So now the car really has transformed, and you'll notice the sound is still, like I said, quite quiet, but we'll get to that here right away. As soon as we hit the freeway, we'll do a quick count up to 100 and we'll see how quick this thing can get there. Okay, so now we've set the car back in standard mode. I want to be fair to the 335. So I'm going to put this in non-M mode, and we're going to set up the shift speed for 5 bars, and we'll just do a rough count. Acceleration, we're on an on-ramp here. So we can do the speed and still be legal. So let's go. I'm going to do a rolling start from 20k an hour. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We were there in about 5 and change from a rolling 20 kilometer an hour start. So there's no question, and that's in the 400 horsepower mode. That's not abusing it. That's not doing the launch control, which could entirely light the rears up and make it even quicker off the line. This car is still plenty quick. 400 horse mode, 5 seconds more or less flat, up to 100k an hour. What can I summarize about the M5? It's tight, it's quiet, it handles exceptionally well, and it's really the wolf in sheep's clothing. And honestly, this is the kind of car that makes a Sunday drive or a Saturday night drive fun. It's the kind of car that I don't necessarily want to drive daily, but when I do take it out on a Saturday night, it really does feel special. This car does feel special. And honestly, I think part of it is just because of its idiosyncrasies. It has huge power, slightly awkward to drive at times, but honestly, all of that boils up to become a very special package. So let's jump into 335 and see what that car is all about. Okay, so now we're in the 335. Just looking around, the car doesn't feel any cheaper than the E60 M5. As a matter of fact, it's very attractive in here. It has lots of leather touch. We've got leather on the side panels and leather seats and a lot of leather touches. There's a lot of plastic in here too, but instead of the aluminum trim in the M5, here we have the wood grain trim, and it looks very, very sharp. Overall, there's a pretty good sense of quality finish in here. Of course, we don't do with the Alcantara ceiling space. The steering wheel doesn't feel quite as beefy. It doesn't have the M paddles and some of the M touches. So of course the car doesn't feel quite as dressed as well. It doesn't have the iDrive or mDrive system in here. So the car does feel slightly stripped out compared to the M5, but it doesn't feel cheap. It still feels very nice in here. The doors do feel a little thinner. There is a little bit more noise that reverbs into the cabin space that you had versus compared to the M5, but it's still very quiet and plush sounding in here. So let's start the beast up and let's go for a ride. Now this car is a little louder, of course, but I do have the cat bypass and open muffler, so it's going to be a bit noisier. So let's get started. We'll roll back and we'll take this beast for a roll and make a good comparison and tell you what we think about this one. Off we go. So firstly, what must be noted, this one does not have an SMG. This one doesn't have an automatic transmission. It does have a manual gearbox. Now, a manual gearbox is also available in the M5 in North America. Mine obviously is an SMG. Some would argue that the manual 6-speed is the way to go, but instead I have this 7-speed SMG in the M5. Here I have a 6-speed manual, and I love the manual transmissions. For me, it brings back the sporting experience. So part of what makes this car interesting is that it's a manual tranny. Now, as we drive down the road, this car is distinctly more smooth. It still has a firm ride because I've got the sport suspension in here, but it doesn't feel quite as darty. It's still crisp in the corners, but it doesn't have that bite that the M5 seems to have, that twitchy bite. As you're changing directions in the M5, it's a little bit more aggressive. This car here is a little bit softened up, although it's still not lacking in performance. The suspension does feel stiff, but not quite as tough in this car, and neither is the steering. So first off, the steering and handling are a lot softer in this car. Next to that, of course, is the ride height. Now, as I mentioned before in the M5 has a very high elevated ride height. You feel like you're sitting up on a stool, bar stool. But in this car, you actually do feel like you're in a sportier car. This car rides lower, it's a coupe, you know, the longer windows, the extended back end, it does feel sportier than the M5, just from a seating perspective. The view outwards will definitely look sportier in this car. Feels sportier based on ride height, and overall that's just the sense that you get. Now don't let all that deceive you. I mean, the M5 is a monster, and as I said, it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. It can be as soft and docile as you want it to be, and it can be as mean as aggressive as you want that to be as well. This car, on the other hand, because it's a manual, there really aren't any dynamic modes in this car. It's a pretty straightforward machine. It's man, gearbox, engine, and rear wheels. It's as simple as that. So it's a very basic vehicle in the sense of drivetrain. It doesn't have all the dynamic stability and all these extra little doodads and novelties that you might get in some of the higher end cars, particularly cars with the autos or SMGs or dual clutch cars. So this car is really just that. It's a good driver's car. This one's a turbo now, Turbo 6, a 3-liter 6-cylinder engine that produces probably a little over 300 horsepower out of the box versus the 500 in the M5. Now, with 300 horse, plenty quick. We know it was faster than the outgoing E60 M5, but at 300 horse, every car nowadays is available almost with 300 horse. Hot hatches and everything else can be found with 300 horsepower. That being said, this already has some mods. I would expect it to be in the 3.25 range right now without the JB4, which, by the way, I have available in this car. So this car really can be as aggressive as you want it to be too, and that's why we're talking about the N54 335 today, because one might ask the question, why am I not comparing the M3, the E92 M3 or E90 M3 versus the E60 M5? You're right. That's a very good distinctive comparison. However, my comparison comes by the fact that this is likely one of the best turbocharged BMW engines available today, and the E60 M5 is one of the best normally aspirated engines of all time in the BMW world. So that's the angle that I'm comparing them with. So taking this car out, obviously it's a little louder, it's a rough ride, but overall it's still a lot more compliant than the M5 in M mode. Oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So as I said, this car with 300 ponies is not slacking in any way. Now, one thing to note with the powertrain specifically isn't just the absolute numbers. The M5 has an engine that revs, it's a very high revving naturally aspirated engine based on F1 tech. Now, because of that, it doesn't have a ton of low down torque at the bottom rev range. You really do need to rev it high to get that power and performance out of it. The 3-liter twin turbo 6 that I'm driving in this car is totally different. It's an entirely different drivetrain. This car here, you don't need the big revs. As a matter of fact, by the time you're at about 5,000 RPM, the car seems to feel like it's run out of steam. Whereas the M5 feels like that's where it's picking up steam. It runs all the way to its 8,250 RPM redline, whereas this car has a redline of 7,000 RPM, but pretty much by the time you're at 6,000, it's pointless going much beyond that. It really has reached its fat torque curve. Its maximum horsepower range you've already exceeded, so there's no point in pushing this car too hard. This car really makes more sense as a daily driver, has more usable punch on the street. The M5 really is something that needs to go to the track, hit the Autobahn. It needs to have its legs stretched, whereas this car doesn't need to stretch its legs too much. The gearing's lower, it doesn't stretch as far in each gear, and again, the fat torque curve at lower revs makes it a much more usable car in traffic, more tractable. As a matter of fact, I can zoom off at 1,000 RPM in second or third gear and the car doesn't lurch, it just off it goes, nice and smooth. So this is a very tractable car that is very practical and has a strong mid-range punch that makes it much more user-friendly for daily driving. So now we'll do a rolling run from 20 kilometers an hour in this car, and we'll just do a rough count and see if this is close to what the M5 is. So everyone, I really hope that shed some light on all of these topics for these two cars for you. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, and then you can catch lots more great content coming up soon. Hope to see you then. Catch you then. Bye-bye.